Version control is a key part of any development team, and this is also the case when it comes to workflows. I'm going to walk you through how you can use version control inside of Kestra to make sure that all of your different Kestra objects are version controlled and up to date. Now, there's different ways you can manage your version control inside of Kestra. I'm going to walk you through the different ways you can do it so you can work out what is the best way for your use case. Now, starting things off, we have the Git Clone task. This is just like using Git Clone inside of your terminal to clone a repository. Now, this is a fantastic task if you want to be able to clone a repository every single time you run a workflow. Maybe you want to make sure you're getting the most up-to-date changes, especially if your repository is constantly changing and new changes are being added every day. So what you can see here is I have a working directory, which basically just gives a number of different tasks a shared folder to work inside of. Git Clone can come in and clone a repository into that folder, and then we can use our Python task underneath here to be able to access that. So here I'm able to run this workflow, and it's going to clone the repository, access the Python file, and as you can see, it's already been able to run the code, no problem. So this is a great option if you want to always make sure you're getting the most up-to-date file, and you also want to make sure that it's not edited between when it leaves that Git repository and when it's running your workflow. Now, another approach you can take is using sync namespace files. So instead of cloning that file as part of the workflow, where you're going to clone it into that working directory and then other tasks can access it, instead, we're going to synchronize it as a namespace file, which is just a file that's stored inside of Kestra that we can then interact with. And so I can create namespace files and I can also edit them directly inside of Kestra. But what we're going to use here is the sync task to automatically pull it from our Git repository and put it here. And then once it's there, instead, we can now use the namespace files property inside of our Python task to be able to give it access to namespace files so it can then run the workflow. So here I don't have to specify a lot more detail. I can just specify that I want the files to be synchronized from a specific folder, and it will just be put in here in the root. So let's execute this and see this one run. And as you can see, this has worked as we expected. And if we click onto the edit flow, we can see it's now synchronized a bunch of different files that I had available in the Git repository. And as you can see, I can open these inside of Kestra, I can actually modify them, and I can add things. So this is also a great option if you want to be able to modify the files without having to keep pushing to Git. You can modify them in Kestra, run your workflow with those quick updates. So this really helps to speed up that development process. Now, it's not just namespace files and code that you want to be able to synchronize using Git. You might also want to be able to synchronize your workflows. While you're editing your workflows inside of Kestra, Kestra does have revisions built directly in, but there's also a peace of mind of being able to have it stored in an external system, especially if you've got multiple instances like a production and a development instance. So this workflow, which runs inside the system namespace, allows you to always synchronize the workflows from your Git repository into Kestra. So this is a great way for making sure that your Kestra instance in production has the most up-to-date changes, and you can combine it with something like a webhook trigger or a schedule to make sure that it's always got those changes once they're available or every day. And as you can see here, this is just simply synchronizing with my repository, and it's just going to override any changes that are there. So it's always going to match the source of truth, which in this case is Git. Now, we've talked about getting your files and workflows into Kestra, but we haven't talked about getting them out of Kestra. Now, if you are someone who finds yourself modifying files directly inside of Kestra for that quick building process, then you might also want to use a system flow like this one, which will push your namespace files back to your Git repository. This is useful if you are constantly working on things inside of Kestra and you want to be able to make sure that other environments can access the changes made to those files. Now, there's two ways you can take this task. You can either run it manually, so in the same way that you would if you were writing the code in your local IDE, you would run git push periodically when you're ready, or you can run it on a schedule to make sure that every day changes are automatically pushed to a Git repository so that, again, you can make sure that other environments reflect the same changes. Similarly, you can also do the same with flows, so you don't have to just push your namespace files, you can also push your flows. This one's a little bit more useful because you will probably be writing your workflows directly inside of Kestra, whereas namespace files you might be writing outside. This means you can just easily get those workflows from Kestra to Git without having to copy and paste them between environments. You can just allow the workflow to do it for you. It's also worth noting that we also have this support for dashboards, so you can push and synchronize your dashboards. You can also, using the Enterprise Edition, push and synchronize your apps and unit tests. So all these Kestra objects can be added to your Git repositories with some handy workflows to manage this process for you. But it can get a little bit tedious having to use each of those tasks to manage all of those Kestra objects. So we've come up with a solution to this, which is our namespace sync, as well as the tenant sync tasks that will synchronize all of these objects in a specified namespace, or if you want to go even further, an entire tenant as well. Now, this task can do both the pushing and the syncing. It depends on what you're trying to do. You can specify the source of truth. So if you want Kestra to be the source of truth, you can make sure it's always pushing changes to the Git repository so that it matches Kestra. But if you'd rather have it the other way around and make sure that Git is your source of truth, you can have it make sure that it's synchronizing changes from Git into Kestra, so your Kestra instance always reflects that Git repository. And this will be able to synchronize all of those objects I described. So that's flows, namespace, files, dashboards, apps, and unit tests. And to give you an idea of what that might look like, as you can see here, inside of the namespace directory that I have in this Git repository, it organizes it into those different objects of flows, files, and apps in my case. If we click into apps, we can see it provides the YAML for that. Files gives us those direct namespace files, and then flow gives us the YAML of all of our different workflows. So hopefully that gives you a good insight into all the different ways version controlling works in Kestra and how you can keep up-to-date versions of all these different objects inside of Kestra. I'm curious to understand what workflows you're going to use. For example, I'm quite a fan of just using a working directory and the Git Clone task for a lot of examples, but for larger repositories where they might take ages to download, that can really slow down the time for your workflows. So I also do like synchronizing namespace files for larger files that you don't want to synchronize as often. But those new namespace sync and tenant sync tasks simplifies that whole process and makes sure that your Kestra repository is always in line with the Git repository. So with all of that in mind, let me know what you think. I'd love to hear how you're using this and how version control works in your system.